Okay, so now what do you need to know in this unit? What do you need to know in this topic? So the first thing you need to know is the relationship between the government budget balance, fiscal policy, and real interest rates. Mr. Romano really introduced you to this last night, so this is going to be a little bit of a review, but let's just put it all together. All right, so I like to use this kind of a number line to conceptualize the budget balance and connect it to the loanable funds market and real interest rates. So remember, when receipts equal outlays, the government is said to be running a balanced budget. The budget balance is zero. When receipts are less than outlays, or when spending is greater than tax revenue, the budget balance is said to be in a deficit, right? The budget balance is less than zero. The government is operating in a deficit or running a deficit. When receipts are greater than outlays, when revenue is greater than expenses, the government is said to be running a surplus. The budget balance is greater than zero. All right, so now let's assume that the government implements some expansionary policy. So the government can either cut taxes, which makes R get smaller, or it can increase spending and transfers, in which case O gets bigger, or it can do both, right? You can have a tax cut combined with an increase in government spending. All of those, right? No matter what option you choose, right, you're going to see the budget balance move towards a deficit. If R gets smaller and you're in a deficit, the deficit is going to get bigger. If R gets smaller when you're operating in a balanced budget, the budget's going to move into a deficit. If R gets smaller and O gets bigger when you're in a surplus, then you're going to move towards a deficit, right? So regardless, expansionary fiscal policy is moving us towards a deficit. So what does that look like in the loanable funds market? So an existing deficit will grow larger because the government has to borrow more money to pay for the increased deficit spending. So when we increase the government borrowing, the demand for loanable funds goes up, which causes an increase in the real interest rate. You can see it here. Now, if the government was operating a balanced budget and it starts and it engages in expansionary fiscal policy, a balanced budget will become a deficit, in which case the government has to borrow money in order to pay for it. So we see an increase in the demand for loanable funds, which drives up the real interest rate. Now, when Mr. Romano took you through some economic history last night, you saw that it wasn't very common for the United States over the past 50 or 60 years to have a surplus, but it does happen. And so if the government is running a surplus and decides to engage in some expansionary policy, the result will be it spends down the surplus, which moves the budget balance towards a deficit. If we don't know the initial budget balance and we don't know the size of the policy, we can't say whether we'll end up in a surplus with a smaller surplus, we'll end up with a balanced budget, or we'll end up in a deficit, but we can say it moves towards a deficit. And we could show the spending down of a surplus as a decrease in the supply of loanable funds. But look what happens. Real interest rates rise. So what conclusions can we draw? And this, again, this is a really important expression, ceteris paribus, all else equal in the absence of no monetary policy, in the absence of any other changes, expansionary fiscal policy leads to an increase in the real interest rate, regardless of the initial condition of the budget balance. So you want to be able to walk that through, okay? Understand that if you know your starting point, you know that the expansionary policy moves you towards a deficit. Regardless of where you started, real interest rates are going to rise. You want to be able to do the same type of thinking for contractionary fiscal policy. So again, you could start by remembering that when receipts are less than outlays, we have a deficit. When receipts are equal to outlays, we have a balanced budget. And when receipts are greater than outlays, we have a surplus. If the government enacts contractionary fiscal policy, it can raise taxes, which makes R get bigger, or it can decrease spending and transfers, which makes O get smaller. So either way, we're going to be moving the budget balance towards a surplus. So if the government is operating in a deficit, it's going to require less borrowed money. So there would be a decrease in the demand for loanable funds. If the government was operating a balanced budget, the government moving into a surplus will become a surplus, right? So as the government runs a surplus, it's saving money. It's got money in its bank account. We see that as an increase in the supply of loanable funds. An existing surplus will get even bigger. So whatever the government's bank balance was, that bank balance goes up, that's loanable funds. So we'd see an increase in the supply of loanable funds. But again, look at what happens to interest rates. If we have contractionary fiscal policy, regardless of our initial condition, real interest rates are going to fall. Okay, so you want to be able to, again, walk that through. All else equal, contractionary fiscal policy leads to a decrease in the real interest rate. Here it is. And you want to be able to explain how that happens for any given initial budget condition. Okay. All right. So what's the second thing you need to know? Now you need to know the definition of crowding out. And so we're going to go back to that relationship between real interest rates and investment spending. And you can probably anticipate where this is going. Crowding out is a term that's applied to the decrease in private domestic investment spending that results from the increase in real interest rates produced by the increase in government borrowing, or a decrease in government savings that results from expansionary policy. Okay, that's it. That's the definition. It's the decrease in private domestic investment spending that results from an increase in real interest rates produced by expansionary fiscal policy. That's crowding out. All right, now how do we show that in an ADAS model? That's the third thing that we want to look at. So let's assume that the economy is in a recessionary gap and that the government is currently operating a balanced budget. That means the budget balance equals zero. It means receipts are equal to outlays, revenue is equal to spending. All right, in a recessionary gap, we know that current output is less than potential output. So here's a recessionary gap. Okay, Y1 is less than YF. And now we know that if we want to try to use economic policy to stimulate aggregate demand, we can employ some expansionary fiscal policy. Remember, AD equals C plus I plus G plus XN. So we want to either increase government spending, right, to get G to go up, or we want to cut taxes to get C to go up. So if the government implements some expansionary fiscal policy, okay, we're going to attempt to close the gap. So this will cause aggregate demand to increase. Okay, so AD1 shifts to AD2. We have a new equilibrium here at full employment levels of output. So we saw that output went up, unemployment goes down, the price level rises, and now the economy is operating at full employment levels of output. But if the government was operating a balanced budget and it implements some expansionary fiscal policy, it's going to move the budget balance into a deficit, which will require the government to borrow money, which is going to increase the demand for loanable funds, which is going to drive up real interest rates. So that's going to cause investment spending to go down. Since investment spending is another component of aggregate demand, the decrease in investment spending is going to cause another shift of aggregate demand. So here's our goal of our expansionary policy, but one of the unintended consequences of that is the increase in real interest rates, which causes I to go down. So where we end up is that this aggregate demand this aggregate demand 3 curve at a new equilibrium with a new price level falls, output falls, unemployment goes up. Okay, let's sort of show that again so you can see it. This is how you graph crowding out. The goal of expansionary fiscal policy is to close a recessionary gap. We want to increase government spending or cut taxes to stimulate aggregate demand. However, expansionary policy in this case is going to cause government borrowing to go up, which is going to drive up real interest rates, which is going to cause I to go down. We showed the decrease in investment spending by shifting aggregate demand back down. When you hear the expression complete crowding out, what they're talking about is all of the increases in aggregate demand that result from the fiscal policy are counteracted by the decrease in investment spending that results from the increase in interest rate. So this would be partial crowding out. Complete crowding out gets us at 83 back here where we were on 81. Okay, so you want to make sure that you can walk through and graph crowding out, expansionary policy, offset by a decrease in investment spending. Okay, and that's what it looks like. All right, so now the next part of the puzzle, the next sequence of events asks us to predict how the economic growth rate of a country is going to be influenced by crowding out. Okay, so this is goes back to the review work we laid out before we got into the what you need to know part. So remember that private domestic spending drives economic growth. So we'll put a lot of these terms together here. Investment spending is spending on capital stock. The more capital stock a country has, the greater the productive capacity of that economy to produce goods and services. So productive capacity refers to the amount of goods and services you can produce, and it's a function of how many resources you have. So our resources are land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. So if our increases in productive capacity are a function of how many resources we have, investment spending is what contributes to the amount of capital. Okay, so a change in investment spending is going to change the rate at which capital stock is added to the economy. So that's the tie-in between investment spending and economic growth. So, and you have to connect those dots. You have to talk about capital formation, additions to capital stock, changes in productive capacity when you're connecting investment spending to economic growth rate. Okay. All right, so all else equal, a decrease in investment spending causes the economic growth rate to slow because fewer capital goods are being added to the economy's productive capacity, or capital formation is occurring at a slower rate. Okay, that's how you describe that. All right, crowding in is the opposite. And crowding in refers to the increases in investment spending and the increases in aggregate demand that would result from contractionary fiscal policy that decreases interest rates. So contractionary policy can drive down interest rates, which could crowd in investment spending, and crowding in could increase the economic growth rate. Okay. All else equal, an increase in investment spending causes the economic growth rate to rise because more capital goods are being added to the economy's productive capacity than before. All right, so let's do a concrete example. So let's assume that annual investment spending equals 100 billion and the economic growth rate is currently 4% per year, and that the government is currently operating in a budget deficit. Okay, that's our starting point. That's our initial condition. Okay, the government cuts taxes, which decreases government revenue, right? Or government receipts. Okay, well, that causes the government budget balance to the negative budget balance to grow larger. The deficit increases, right? We move into a bigger deficit. Okay, I apologize for that. There's a real increase in internet usage in my neighborhood with all of the online schooling and all of the at-home working. So hopefully you had time to think about the answer to that question, and you have determined that the economic growth rate will be, in fact, less than 4%. Okay, so these are all the steps you want to, this is the reasoning that you want to have going on in your mind when you're considering the relationship between expansionary fiscal policy, real interest rates, investment spending, and economic growth. So that's skill 3B. They don't get more skill 3B than that, putting all of those dots together. Okay. All right, so the final topic in this is what actions can be taken by policymakers to offset the increase in interest rates caused by expansionary fiscal policy. And you might be able to predict this. And if you're watching the news, you're seeing it in action right now. So we know that the government just passed a massive expansionary fiscal policy, $2 trillion. It was the size of it, the largest expansionary fiscal policy package in our nation's history. And the week before, simultaneously, what was going on, the Fed was conducting major increases in the rate at which it was adding money to the money supply in order to try to offset some of the economic problems that are resulting from the situation we currently find ourselves in. So if you can connect those dots, you can think about the role that monetary policy can play in terms of mitigating the increase in real interest rates that could be caused by expansionary fiscal policy. So this is going to allow us to show skill 3B in a slightly different way too, because very often on the AP exam, you are asked about you might be asked a question like, how could the Fed counteract the effects of the fiscal policy on real interest rates? You could be asked a question of questions about simultaneous monetary and fiscal policy on interest rates and investment spending. So these are the steps that you want to be able to walk through. I alluded to this when I did, when Mr. Romano and I did lesson 5.1, because we were looking at expansionary fiscal and monetary policy, but only on what was going on in the ADAS model. Now we can add in the effects on interest rates and investment spending. So we know that expansionary fiscal policy is designed to stimulate aggregate demand, to cause real GDP to increase, to cause employment to rise, and one of the short-run consequences of that is an increase in the price level. There's our Phillips curve. All right, now what happens to interest rates because of expansionary fiscal policy? They go up. What happens to investment spending? It goes down. So now when we do expansionary monetary policy, you'll remember it's also designed to increase aggregate demand. It's also going to stimulate spending to increase real GDP. Employment will go up, unemployment will go down, and it comes with, in the short run, some increases in the price level. But expansionary monetary policy or increases in the money supply cause interest rates to fall, which can cause investment spending to rise. Okay, we'll get into a little bit more detail how to connect the nominal interest rates in the money market to real interest rates in the loanable funds market when we get into our review videos. But the effect of expansionary monetary policy is to drive down interest rates and increase investment spending. So if you're asked a question about the effects of simultaneous monetary and fiscal policy, if they're moving together, if they're both expansionary, the effect on economic outcomes is determinate, but the effect on interest rates and the effect on investment spending are going to be indeterminate because we don't know which policy is going to have a stronger effect on interest rates. Okay, so we're bringing multiple concepts together here in this. All right, this contractionary monetary policy can mitigate the decrease in real interest rates that might result from contractionary fiscal policy. So be sure you can understand and explain how expansionary monetary policy can offset crowding out, but you also want to make sure you can walk through the effect of opposing policies on all these variables, as we started to do in lesson 5.1. All right, there's another way to approach enacting some expansionary fiscal policy that is unlikely to produce an increase in interest rates, and that's to take a balanced budget approach to fiscal policy. So this is going to review a little bit about multipliers, and if this is something that's a little fuzzy for you, don't be too concerned about it. We are going to review multipliers in great detail when we do our review topics. But remember that government spending is a more powerful tool on aggregate demand than changes in taxes or transfers. And you might remember that the spending multiplier is 1 over the marginal propensity to save, and that the tax and transfer multiplier is MPC over MPS, marginal propensity to consume over marginal propensity to save, and it moves in opposite directions. This just means inverse. Okay, so if the marginal propensity to consume is 0.75, then the spending multiplier is 4 and the tax multiplier is -3. So what does this look like? What would a balanced budget approach to fiscal policy look like? If the government raises spending by $10 billion, once the multiplier kicks in, right, aggregate demand will eventually go up by a total of $40 billion. So increase in government spending by 10 billion produces, when the marginal propensity to consume is 0.75, will lead to a maximum increase in aggregate demand of 40 billion. Now, if the government simultaneously raises taxes by 10 billion, right? So this is expansionary, this is contractionary, right? Aggregate demand will go down by 30 billion because the tax multiplier is 3. There's no autonomous change in aggregate demand, right? When the government cuts taxes or raises taxes. So what's the net effect on the budget balance? There's none, because if you raise spending by 10 billion and you pay for it with increased tax revenue of 10 billion, you're not going to affect the budget balance, which means the government's not going to move into a deficit or into a surplus, which means there's not going to be any change in the loanable funds market. But you still get some expansionary effect because an increase of 40 billion, which is offset by a decrease of 30 billion, still produces an increase in aggregate demand of $10 billion. Okay. All right, so that's something that you want to sort of understand, is if you want to, if there might be a question like, if the government wanted to engage in expansionary fiscal policy and didn't want to cause crowding out, what could it do? The answer is it could raise taxes by the same amount, because the spending multiplier is greater than the tax multiplier. You're still going to get some expansionary effect. Obviously, an expansionary effect of 10 billion is less than an expansionary effect of 40 billion, but there's not going to be any crowding out because you're not going to have the government borrowing more money. Okay.